Hello, hello, and welcome to the Color Whisperer Show, where we talk about all things home and healing. And today we have a very special guest. And if you are a loyal follower, you have seen her before. Her name is Mary O'Connor, and she is an amazing therapist. And we're going to talk about invisible loss. Grief takes on so many levels, and some of it's really easy. A parent dies, a spouse dies, somebody close to your family, somebody close in your family dies, and everybody's people are there for you. Well, we don't deal with grief in this country very well, so that's a whole other topic. But people can see that grief, and they'll do what they can do to help. But there's all kinds of invisible loss, invisible grief. And the toll can be just as difficult for the person going through it. However, that community support isn't there because it's invisible. So, welcome, Mary. I'm super excited about today's show. So come on and let's talk about all this amazing topic.
Hello, thank you so much for having me back on your show.
Oh, it's a pleasure. We had so much fun the last time.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to be talking about invisible loss, and you used a psychological term when we talked about this disruptive grief. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe the term I used was disruptive attachments.
Disruptive attachments. Thank you. So let's start there because when you said,
Sure.
well, let's talk about disruptive attachments, I went, in English, please.
Sure.
So let's start with what is a disruptive attachment?
Sure. So let's start with attachment theory. I know I talked about this on the last time I was on, but for anybody that is new to me, attachment theory basically says that the attachments that we form as infants to our mothers or primary caregivers, that sets the blueprint for the rest of our lives and our adult relationships. And if somebody has a secure attachment, they're able to separate from their mom and then go back to their mom. And that's about, I think it's between 70 or 80% of our population. But there's a lot of people who have insecure attachments. This can look like when, as an adult, if your partner leaves, it's really hard to have them leave. You might be fear they're going to abandon you or leave you. And there's also avoidant attachments where that intimacy, that closeness can feel really, really scary.
Absolutely.
And so from an attachment lens, given how important attachments are and how they are for our relationships and, our sense of self, it brings up the question, what happens if there's a disruption in that early attachment, and how can that impact you for the rest of your life?
What does a disruption mean? Let's go into what does that look like?
Yeah, it can look like a lot of different ways. To name a few: adoption, parental divorce, parental incarceration, where either you're completely separated from a parent or there's, let's call it a ambiguous loss, ambiguous separation. You still have your dad, but you see him less because maybe mom has majority custody.
And this could even be if, dad has a job or mom has a job where they're away a lot. Maybe they're a pilot or a truck driver, or they travel a lot for business, or there's a lot of reasons where dad is not, or it could be mom too.
Or mom too.
It doesn't have to just be dad. We kind of default to dad, but
sure. I'm so glad that you named that, because you're absolutely right. And as a therapist, a lot of times I'll be working with someone and a common theme I hear is, well, nothing really bad happened to me.
Right.
Like you're talking about in your intro, when there's a death, a really concrete loss, you can point to that.
Right.
But I see a lot of, let's say, more subtle losses that are a bit more nuanced that still really hurt, but we don't really talk about it enough. We don't really name that pain.
Right.
And then that can be psychologically damaging in and of itself when it's not named.
And if a parent is absent, and absent can be in many ways, they can be emotionally absent.
Yes.
Maybe they're on the spectrum. Maybe
Mhm.
they're just, I'm going to just speak from my own experience, but some men are afraid of babies, and they're so tiny,
Yeah.
and they're like, well, I don't know what to do with that. My ex was like, he was, oh, I don't know what to do with a baby. I'm like, well, you didn't have one anyway, but he was afraid of what to do with a baby. He was fine with the idea of a child, but
Sure.
a baby scared him because they're so tiny and they're so vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so, I don't think he's and it is. I mean, I remember the first time I held a baby that was
For sure.
a day or two old. I was like, oh my gosh, it is a little frightening. And then you're in
Sure.
charge of making sure this little baby's okay,
Yeah.
and so it is but there's an emotionally absent that can be as well. And if
Yes.
they're not emotionally absent, then it's like, well, my parents were there for me. Well, but were they?
Exactly. And I'm really glad you named this, because people might think, oh, it's just an infant, they're not going to remember.
But they do.
They do. And there's this, I really like to name what I call the felt sense. You can, a baby, an infant can feel when mom, when dad, caregiver is fully present and giving that loving gaze, that attunement. But some adults, it's hard to do that, depending on what you've gone through. If your parents weren't attuned to you, it can be really hard to form that attachment. And a lot of times these attachment patterns are passed down intergenerationally. And so there's this notion of the felt sense, and it can be, psychologically harmful for the baby when it's not feeling that attunement. It's not feeling that love, that felt sense from that parent. And then that can, contribute to the development of a insecure attachment.
Mm-hmm. Oh, babies definitely know. I mean, anybody who's a regular to the show, my father died when I was a year old. And so it was, I don't remember any of this, but there's folklore, family folklore of, I wouldn't let a guy come near me for a year. Like if we went to a restaurant and a guy brought the high chair, I wouldn't sit in it. But they take the same high chair away, take it away. If a woman brought it, I'd be fine.
Yeah.
And so, I can't tell you what was going on in my little head at that age. I don't have any quote unquote memories of it.
Yeah.
And yet I've had several things in my life where I can say, oh, that goes back to this. And so knowing, and I don't know. So I have this folklore. Is that good for us everybody has, well, when you were little, right? Our parents do that, right?
Yes.
Is it good to know their stories, or are they actually planting seeds of trauma? Or I don't know, is it trauma is the right word?
Well, what I'll say is that even if you don't remember,
right,
your body remembers.
Oh, I know that.
And the book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's these memories, they're stored in your body. So you might not consciously remember it, but if it's hard for you to do certain things, or sometimes it can manifest like stomach aches, or there's a correlation. I know correlation doesn't equal causation, but there's a correlation between trauma and fibromyalgia, for example. Our bodies store that trauma. And so I just want to name that, because I don't know how much it matters if you know or don't know what you're saying, but it's your body knows.
I know that for sure, because the anniversary of my mother's death, the anniversary of my miscarriage, I'll be fine, and then all of a sudden I'm like, God, I'm really depressed today. And I'm some people memorialize those days.
Sure.
I've chosen not to. I don't want to. That doesn't feel good for my way of dealing with grief. But I'll look at the calendar and I'm like, oh, that's why I'm sad.
Yeah.
So I
Yep.
know that our bodies remember, even though
Totally.
our brains don't. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, and I'm glad Mary is with us and everything. It's actually based on what y'all were talking about, because I remember when I was a youngster and I was a young baby, I actually went to the country of Turkey. And some people say I have an international flavor, even though I've only been to two countries in my entire life and everything. But I just wondered how much of our memories are actually, and even some of the grief that we have, are impacted by things that we may not remember. Because even when you're talking about the being the baby, I know, speaking of folklore, that people tell me that when I went there as a 3 month old infant and everything, and I think I was there till three, that I was spoiled by the natives of that particular part of Turkey and everything. But I have no memory of that. Like I said, I just know what my parents told me and all along those lines. But how does that impact some of our memories and even some of the grief that we may have had as well? Because like I said, I did not really know my granddad on my father's side, because that's the one that passed literally when I was a baby. So I think he passed while I was in Turkey and everything. But I have no memory of him hardly at all. But I was just wondering, how much does this early development play into our thoughts? Because I'm kind of, like I said, I know what folklore says. Is that they say they spoiled the heck out of me, but if one of them literally could walk through the door today and I would not know who they were.
Sure. It's a great question. And there's parts of it in terms of like brain development, and we don't remember, what's happened to us as babies. Our body remembers. And there's a lot of, when you bring this up, what it makes me think of is there's a lot of different ways how things can impact our memory. So for example, when I see somebody that's had a lot of trauma, especially a lot of childhood trauma, it's really common for them to not remember a lot of their childhood, to not remember huge gaps of time. And sometimes that happens because it's our body's way of protecting us. Mm-hmm. It's too much, it's too intense. So we disassociate, we check out, so we don't cognizantly remember it. Like I said, our body still does.
Yeah. Speaking of that, then I'm going to bounce off and turn it back over to Jeanette. How much is an issue with being, because I know I hear this even from friends, I've heard from other people as well, and Jeanette kind of alluded to it, but a lot of people are wanting to be in relationships, but they're also afraid of relationships because there's this notion of people being commitment phobes and all along those lines. And I've definitely heard that from a number of folks, but I'm just wondering your take on how much is a real ailment and how much of that has to do with our past traumas, even past relationship traumas as well.
Oh, great question. I'd say that is what we say in social work, a both and. I think commitment issues are real. And a lot of people that have commitment issues tend to have more of an avoidant attachment style. And a lot of that, I believe, is related to trauma. And when you think about it, especially intergenerationally, if your parents weren't there for you, if you learned that it's not safe to be vulnerable, if you're vulnerable, you're either going to be punished or ignored, you're not going to get your needs met, then that idea of vulnerability as an adult can be terrifying, because I'm going to let somebody in and they're going to let me down. Yep. Just like mom did, just like dad did. And I believe that is rooted in trauma. Because there's, speaking to the neglect that Jeanette was talking about earlier, that is a trauma when the baby is crying and crying and crying and the parents don't come and soothe the baby. The baby doesn't have the skills to self-soothe. And
the doctors used to, like in my age group, they told us, leave the baby cry, and so you have, that's what I was taught was like, I mean, you cuddle it to a certain point,
Sure.
But I had a child that I babysat for a while, and as soon as mom left, he cried and he cried and he cried and he cried and he cried. And I would play with him. I held him. I did everything. And after about, half an hour, 45 minutes, I was like, well, I'm going to put you in bed, I'm like, and then I'd go in and he would stop crying. And as soon as I go in, he'd stop crying. And
Yeah.
okay, come on, let's get up and play. And then he'd start crying again as soon as I brought him out. I guess he saw that mom wasn't there.
Sounds like it.
And so it was really a tough babysitting job. But you don't just like throw a kid who's crying in bed and da da da, but a baby, it's like if they're not soothing, there's a point where what my generation was raised with was you just let them cry themselves to sleep.
Yeah. And I know, and it's so interesting to me how, medicine and recommendations can change over time, because I know that was the recommendation for such a long time. But now we're finding that there are real problems with that because babies don't know how to soothe themselves. That's why they need us. They need adults to help teach them that.
Yeah. My mom tells the story that I was cold all the time. And so as soon as they'd pick me up, I would stop crying.
Yeah.
As soon as they put me in bed, I would cry again. So now this would never fly today. But they put a heater underneath my bed, underneath my cot or crib, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And then I slept fine. But it took them a while to figure out I was just plain cold. And I was born in the winter, so yeah.
And as a baby, you can't say I'm cold. You can't say that. So what do? You cry. That's how you communicate.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about the adoption thing, because there is an interesting loss, even if the child goes straight from one mother to the next. They were never left alone. They never had to go into a foster home or something like that. But even there's still a loss of the original mother, and the child may not. How does that work with the child? Because the child doesn't remember it's again the body remembers. But let's talk about that, because that really is an invisible loss.
It is.
Some kids they don't find out that till they're adults that they're adopted. They may never find out. I think today's world where we've got all these 23andMe stuff like that, I think it's a lot easier to find your birth parents. I want to find out who great grandma was. Oh, guess what?
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of surprises happening.
Sure.
But there is still that, like, well, who was my mom? Is it better for the children to know who their birth parents and have an open adoption or a closed adoption? Because in my day, when we adopted my sister, the closed adoption seemed like the best thing. But I have a dear friend who adopted a child, and it ended up being an open adoption. And thus far, anyway, that seems to have been okay with the child. She seems to get, the difference between the two. And I mean, I had my father who was responsible for my birth, and then my dad who raised me.
Sure.
So I had, so talk a little bit about how much is it good to know the person who didn't keep you? Yeah,
that's a really good question. And I want to say it depends, and we'll go into it. But what I'll say is that attachment starts in utero.
Yes.
As the baby's developing, there's stories of like babies kicking at certain times, and, people reading to their babies in utero. So this is a great example of that invisible loss, because that baby, this human, is forming this connection to the mom. And to lose that, right away, or to never have that, that's got to have an impact.
Right.
And, as I've shared with you before, I have a personal attachment to this topic because my mom was adopted. And she's adopted from Germany. And I think she was adopted around the age of 3. So there was time when she was in an orphanage, but she, didn't know her mom. And what she still struggles with today is still coping with this loss, because when she was growing up, she was always told, you should be grateful.
Mm.
You have so much to be grateful for. This family saved
It doesn't feel good the way you say it. It doesn't. Yes, she should be grateful that she's not in an orphanage. She got blessings of having a family, but the feeling I get when you say that is well, if you did something wrong, well, you should be grateful and listen to me. Like it was almost a punishment.
Yeah, and it's a invalidation of the pain, which can cause more pain because you're struggling, but then someone says you shouldn't be struggling. So the message is like, well, what's wrong with me? When grieving that loss or being upset is a completely normal human response. And yeah, it's really hard when someone says, yeah, don't be upset about that, because you are, and understandably so. And it's interesting then how that can shape your identity, your sense of self. I think with adoption, and also in general, when people are told they shouldn't feel a certain way, it tends to show up as anxiety later in life.
Right. And what do we do with kids? Don't cry. When a child's feeling some pain, there's a limit, right? I mean, there's a point where they become too emotional, but we got to let them cry. Come here, let me make it better. Tell me what's wrong with you.
Exactly. Soothing.
Tell me what's going on. It's not so much, and as parents, we want to make everything better.
Yeah.
But you know what? Sometimes the best thing we can do is to just hold the little kid and let them cry. Let them tell you what is wrong in their mind. I mean, after my mom died, there's times when I'm just like, I remember there was one day I just was like, I need somebody to hold me.
Yeah.
I was sitting on the couch and I'm like, or I just want somebody to not even hold me, I just wanted somebody to be there with me. They didn't have to talk. They didn't have to, we could sit and watch some stupid movie. I didn't care.
Yeah.
And I couldn't pick up the phone, and because it wasn't for me, it was a very big need, but it wasn't an emergency. Right. And so it's like, and I mean, this can happen on many different layers, the miscarriage, whatever. This is the one I'm remembering. But now there's a number of people I could have picked up the phone and said, I'm having an emergency. Will you drop everything and come over?
Yeah.
And of course they would have said, yeah, but it wasn't an emergency. But the need for me was the same pain level as if I was saying, I need to go to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
But I couldn't figure out how to say I need to go to the hospital when I just need you to come sit next to me,
Yeah,
and
you need
so
that
I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't pick up the phone because people have lives, and it was like, not that anybody would have done any, but I'm sorry, I've got an appointment, but if it had been, I need you to take me to the hospital.
Yeah.
It would have been yes, right? And
sure.
So it was this really weird dichotomy for me of like, this feels like something huge.
Yes.
But what I'm wanting is something so simple.
Yeah.
And this is one of the ways that grief gets ignored and because, hi, my friend, I need you to come over and sit on the couch next to me.
Yeah.
Well, I've got this, and I just really need you to drop everything and come sit on the couch next to me. I mean, it felt so stupid, right? But this is that invisible grief that happens on so many different levels. It doesn't have to be a parent death. It can be, in the case of adoption, like, I've got this deep grief inside me and I don't even know where it comes from. Why do I have this sadness?
Yeah.
Because, I have a loving family. Okay.
Exactly.
So why if life is so good, why do I feel this deep sadness inside?
It,
And then how do you get to that sadness and let it out?
yeah. Well, I think naming it is really important.
Sorry.
And it's emotional. It really is. And it's so important that we're talking about this. You know, for me, something that really, I don't know what a clicking moment for me was actually about this time last year. My parents were in the process of moving, and my mom actually found her old adoption papers.
Mm.
And she sent them to me, as well as a picture of when she was 6. And she sent them to me as like, oh, isn't this cool that I found this? But I looked at the eyes in the pictures, and the eyes of that little girl in that orphanage. And I was just overwhelmed with grief. And I said to her, Mom, like, look at the difference in the eyes from when you were in the orphanage versus when you were 6. Oh my gosh. And I feel like me just naming that unlocked this level of grief that she was able to allow herself the space to process and name and cry about and feel those feelings that she's been holding in for so long.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So naming it and allowing that space for it really goes a long way, because a person can feel like they're crazy when they're like, I've had a great life. Why am I so sad
Right?
inside? Yeah. And you're not crazy. And, anxiety makes sense, because anxiety shows up when these other feelings aren't named and aren't allowed to be felt.
Absolutely. And it's a tough feeling. And I think especially if you don't know that you're adopted,
Yeah.
that must be, we were talking about the folklore, and the folklore for me has been, oh, this is why,
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't have that folklore,
Yeah.
it's there's just this unexplained grief,
Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
and if you were never told,
Sure.
how do you, like, you're just sad, you don't even know why.
Yeah.
And then that leads into drugs, not
Mm-hmm.
drugs. Well, it could go into bad drugs, or it
Sure.
could be good drugs. Either way, it could lead to drugs.
Yeah. Because I
But
think people use
depression,
substances when they're trying to cope.
yeah, yeah. So let's talk about another layer of this. Mark, I'm sorry, I can't read your notes. So Mary, if you can read them.
What about the unexpected of losing a home?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, losing a job.
Yeah. Think about the kids living in tent villages. Yeah. Totally. That losing a home, losing your community, that is absolutely major loss.
Yeah. Changing schools for a kid.
Yes.
I changed school. I went to 4 different schools growing up.
Yeah.
So it's you kind of just get used to it. Oh, starting over again, But it's, I know people, oh, I've got friends from grade school. I'm like, I can't even fathom
Yeah.
that.
For sure.
I've got a friend from high school, got some, well, more than one friend, but I've got some friends from high school. But anything below that, yeah, it just,
Mm-hmm.
I switched, and, the world changed, and we never
Yeah.
moved, but I went to 4 different schools.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that can be a big thing for a kid. I have a
Yeah.
friend right now that they're looking at moving, but the son is in his senior year of high school.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really tough year to
Yeah.
change. So they're trying to figure out how to keep
Mm-hmm.
in that city, at least for him to graduate, and then they can move,
Yeah. Because, moving schools, on the surface, when I say, oh, not a big deal. But when you change schools, you're losing access to the friends that you once had and the ways that you engaged with them. And that in and of itself can be a confusing loss, because, oh, I can still see you. I can still call you. We can still have play dates, but it's not the same.
It's not.
And there is a sense of loss in that. And just, with any change, with any new chapter does come a closing of an old one. And there's grief and loss in there. And that deserves to be named and felt and given space for.
And even, I know during COVID, everybody lost friends,
Yeah.
for whatever reason. We've all
Mhm.
lost friends.
Yep.
And some people just kind of faded away.
Yeah.
And there's a loss there too. Now
Oh,
it's
yeah.
a little bit more subtle, but sometimes somebody just stops calling you and stops talking to you and you don't even know why.
Mhm.
And, clearly there's something going on their side, but if they're not willing to talk to you about it,
Yeah.
and, COVID divided us so much,
Yeah.
and whatever side of the fence you were on, many people lost friends who were on the other side of the fence.
Yeah.
And, yeah, and there's loss there of just, and it doesn't even have to be COVID, but
Yeah.
sometimes people, like when I first got divorced, friends just like, some of my married friends were just like, oh, I don't know what to do with you now.
Mhm.
When I was in my 30s and my friends started having kids, the ones
Yeah.
with babies, oh, I don't know what to do with you now.
Sure.
And I'd call them and they'd ask about my life and I ask them about theirs and like, oh, mine's just changing diapers and feeding babies. I'm like,
Mhm.
yeah, but I care about that. Like,
Yeah.
I can't have one, but that doesn't mean I don't care that you're going through this incredible thing called motherhood.
Sure.
It can be boring and frustrating and tiresome and joyful, and well, it's like, I'm excited to hear that your baby can turn over or can walk, or all the little major steps. Like, I want to hear what's going on in your life, but they never wanted to talk about it.
Yeah.
And they had their mommy friends that they could do that with,
Mhm.
and they didn't want me in that realm.
Yeah.
And so they just kind of faded away a little bit, and so there's even some grief there.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad we're talking about this because as a society, we give a lot of weight and space to romantic relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say in this case, breakups. Albums are written about breakups. But I don't think we talk enough about the friendship breakups.
Yeah.
Which can be, in my opinion, just as painful. I'm a person that has really long lasting friendships typically. And it's, hey, you've been in my life for 10 years. I love you. I value you. And now we don't talk anymore.
Right.
And it's a profound sense of loss that can be invisible because it doesn't get the same amount of attention, weight, recognition as a romantic relationship loss.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's still grief there. You still have to go through the grieving process, and as in school, it's like, I have this little vision of this little 7-year-old. Oh, Timmy doesn't like me anymore. Okay, so you go find another friend. But as we get older, it's a little bit harder. I mean, the school environment is an easy place to create friendships.
Yeah.
And once you get, or the work environment sometimes. But the more you get away from those environments, the harder it is. I had a client who was in her 80s. Wonderful, wonderful lady. I'm so blessed to have had her as my client. And she's like, Jeanette, I love what you do so much. I would love to recommend you, but all my friends are dead or they're far away, or, she says, I don't, she had one other friend that she really saw on a regular basis. And then that lady moved away, and, she's like, I don't know how to make friends at my age.
Mm-hmm.
She wasn't into going to the senior center. That really wasn't for her. Driving was getting hard for her. So she's stuck at home. How is she supposed to make friends? She's not going on the computer and, so that's another level of grief.
Totally. I think any major life change can come with grief. And it is hard to make adult friendships. And I think especially as we get, even older. And, I work with a lot of college students and we're in graduation season. And, I try to really validate the loss around that because graduation and society is celebrated. It's this yay, exciting
Right?
thing.
But
And
there's a loss.
yeah, and you tell your friends, oh, we're going to keep in touch.
But you don't.
And even if you do, it's different though. You can't walk across campus and hang out.
There's no more. One of the wonderful things I loved about college was it'd be like 11 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the morning. And like you maybe you go to the bathroom or you're just hanging out in the lobby or something. And then there's somebody else there. And next thing you know, you're having this like 2-hour conversation. And like that doesn't happen anywhere else.
Yeah.
You know? And my experience of college was that there was more, people were more open and talking about things. And well, tell me why you think that. There wasn't, at my age, it's like, well, this is right. I'm like, no.
Uh-huh.
I mean, well, tell me why you think that. Let's explore this. Why do you have a different opinion than I do? Let me tell you what created this opinion in me. And because it has to do with our life traumas, right?
Yeah.
And how we lived our life and how we coped with that.
Yes.
And so all of this comes in. So let's talk about another grieving that you're dealing with college kids, and it really is essentially a loss of childhood that they're grieving.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And for women, we get that too around 13.
Yes.
I don't know I don't know if boys get it or not, but we get a very clear sign around 13 that you're not a child anymore.
Mm-hmm.
and there is some invisible grief there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's depending on where you're at or who you're with, sometimes this can be celebrated, right? You're becoming a woman, but there is that loss of what if I still want to be a kid,
right?
I remember when I was a kid, my dad, sitting me down, being like, you're only going to be a kid once. And that really like sat with me. And then, that associated grief. Then when you grow up, you step away from childhood, that carefree, part of your life where you're completely taken care of. And with any major change, it does come with that loss. That's worth giving space to. Because I think so often we just brush it off. We're like, oh, they're fine. It's not that big of a deal. This happens to everyone. Yes, it does. And it's okay to have feelings about it.
Yeah. And then on the other end of it, there's a time where you realize, you're not going to have children for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And then when the period goes away,
mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, there's the mythological, the maiden, was it 3 stages of woman? There's but you become the crone.
Yeah, the crone, maiden, and crone.
Yeah. And it's like, wait a minute. I didn't ask for this,
Yeah. Totally.
I don't want to be the crone. There's, and in actuality, the crone, there's a lot of wisdom around the crone, but
she's wise.
Right. She's wise, but she's also not very pretty oftentimes. And we have this whole witch, the crone equals the witch, and that has a lot of bad publicity. And I wouldn't go back to be 20 for nothing. There's no way. I mean, even if I knew everything I know now, like, I don't want to learn, there's lessons I don't want to have to go through again.
Fair.
Right? So like I'm very appreciative of when I grew up and everything. And, there's some good experiences, and, I like who I am today, but you want me to go relive all that crap again? Hell no.
Yeah.
No. If I can go be 25 again, and the career that I've started can escalate from the point of 25, that might be a different story. But like have to go back, and who do you want to be You know, what do you want to be? What do you want? Like all that stuff? No way.
Yeah.
So there is some joy in the crone of,
Yeah.
and we don't,
Sure.
I don't care what you think about me, you know, like
Yeah.
20, it's a whole different feeling than at 20. It was like,
Totally.
right?
Yeah. And I think something can be a loss and also be a celebration.
Absolutely.
Both things can exist. And I think it's so important to give and allow space for both. Yeah, I'm in this, crone era of my life, and I'm going to celebrate that and the wisdom associated with it and grieve the loss of I'm not in the, let's say, the maiden stage anymore.
Right.
And so it can all be true, and we can call in and allow space for that complexity.
I had another quick question. Sorry to bother you. Y'all talking about healing loss, and this is a very powerful conversation. What about the loss that people have when they have to deal with their health issues? Because I know that I've had family members that have lost and have had their bald spots widen, and I've had definitely folks that have had to, get instead of the regular glasses, the bifocals, or get some dental work, and all along those lines. So that seems to me that that is a loss that oftentimes happen as we go through the aging process that isn't oftentimes addressed.
Absolutely.
I was wondering your thoughts
Yeah.
around that, Mary.
Absolutely. These are other great examples of these invisible losses.
Mhm.
If an extreme version, let's say somebody loses an arm,
Mhm.
we can see that.
Right.
And there's also that grief associated with that loss. But even the more subtle ones, let's say your vision isn't
Mhm.
as good anymore. You get glaucoma or cataracts.
Right.
Or you can't drive anymore, or maybe you can't go for that 4-mile run anymore, whatever,
Yeah.
there's a level of, I can't do this
Mhm.
anymore.
Yeah, and the loss of I may not be able to. And, that's a loss of potentially your identity, or a part of your identity, a part of your joy. And, there are certain things where it's harder to see. So it's harder to, let's say, get that support and name this in terms of an issue that impacts your mental health.
And speaking of that and everything, because one of the things that I've had a couple of friends of mine that did, because they wanted to go on these life-changing moves in life, whether that was moving to Costa Rica, or whether that was opening up businesses, or whether that was whatever they wanted to do. But it kind of comes back to what you were talking about earlier, Jeanette, is I do know quite a few of them, at least 3 or 4 that I can think of off the top of my head, that decided not to do it because they were waiting for the kids to graduate from either high school or college, because they did not want to disrupt that lifestyle. Because I have matter of fact, they haven't made the move yet. They've been talking about it for almost, I want to say, 10 years. We went to Costa Rica and everything, but they wanted to wait first for the kid to get out of high school, and then for the kid to get out of college and everything. And I've had some folks that have been in that business space as well. So I didn't know if you had any thoughts around that, Mary, because that seems to be a common trend, particularly in this day and time.
Yeah, I think this circles back to what we were talking about earlier with how changing schools, how that can be a big loss for kids. And, I'm holding space for if you're changing countries, and that's even more of a loss. You're even further from your friends.
Right. Different language.
Yeah, totally.
So I want to spend a few minutes talking about one of your things that is very close to your heart. And that is, how does a child do when there's an incarcerated parent? Because that's an invisible loss.
Absolutely. And this is a really important one to name as we're on this topic. And there's a lot of research done around this. And the term that gets brought up most often is ambiguous loss. Because when a parent is incarcerated, you're losing them in a sense, because you're losing access to them. It's really hard to visit. It's hard to even talk on the phone.
Everybody's listening. There's no privacy.
Yes. And the parent is still alive. So it's not the same grief as if a parent died. There's a name for that, a process around that, support around that. But when a parent's incarcerated, it can be quite ambiguous, because dad or mom is still there, but they're not there in the same way in my life.
And there may be some shame around even telling people
Yeah.
about a parent so that's
Yeah.
incarcerated and say, well, where's your dad? Well, he's gone, you know,
Yeah. A lot
or
of
where's
shame, a
your
lot of
mom? But,
stigma.
maybe they just say, well, I can't, they're not in my life, I mean,
Hmm.
so there's that level too.
Yeah. And what I think is, I like to look at cycles a lot and patterns, and there can become like this cycle of incarceration, because if you're not able to really grieve or give space to this loss, it's going to impact your mental health. If there's all this shame, this stigma, and then there's not the words, the grieving process given to a little kiddo,
No.
that's going to can not going to, because everyone's different, but that can impact the way they see the world.
And it can become part of their identity too,
Sure.
I never really saw my mother as handicapped, but
Mhm.
every now and then, oh, was that handicapped lady your mother? I'm like, huh? Oh,
Mm.
yeah. But she didn't look at it that way.
Yeah.
So as her child, I never saw her that way.
Yeah.
However, there were some things where I know I did compensate for that, and but if that can become I'm the child of. Well,
Hmm.
I had a dear friend in college who was very much abused, and she didn't want children because she said abusers abuse, and I don't want to abuse anybody. And you're so, we tried to tell her that's not, you are so anti this, and it's not who
Mm.
you are to abuse.
Wow.
But because she was young and she was 16 in college, so that says a lot right there. So before 16, she had this in her head that abusers abuse.
Hmm.
And she never had children
Wow.
because of that line. She
Yeah.
never wanted to hurt a child so much. She never had a child.
Wow. That's really powerful. And there's so much to unpack in what you just shared. And I think not everybody that has been abused will become abusive.
I agree.
And oftentimes abusers were abused themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And, the concept around this that I think is really relevant, especially today, is this concept of the trauma triangle, where there's the victim, the victimizer, and the bystander. And until that trauma is healed, what tends to happen is people might jump around. So somebody who is a victim becomes a victimizer or becomes a bystander. And patterns like this can repeat unconsciously until they're named, identified, felt, and ultimately broken.
Yeah. And is that really the secret to getting through this grief? I mean, I know my personal story with my father is that grief was stuck in my body till I found a natural healer who was
Yeah.
able to unleash it.
Yeah.
I sobbed for 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't had an asthma attack since. I've never
Wow.
sobbed for 3 hours either since then. But that was 25 years of grief that was
Mm-hmm.
just stuck in my body. And
Yeah.
if we can allow that grief to release,
Yes.
it's super powerful. And feeling it can be scary.
It can be. And I'll validate that.
And
And
that's why
there
we need
can,
somebody like you to be there with us as we unpack that grief.
yeah, I think a therapist can be really helpful for that, because it can feel scary. So a lot of therapy is helping someone learn how to feel and how to sit with their feelings in a way that shows you can do it. I believe there is a profound beauty in sadness. And that might sound wild to hear. Like, how can sadness be beautiful? But if you can really truly sit with yourself in these periods of sadness and get through to the other side, there is something just deeply beautiful about that and showing up for yourself in that way. But yes, I think therapy can really be really helpful. It's part of the reason why I got trained in EMDR, is to help people really process through that grief, because unfortunately, for those of you out there that are trying to avoid the feelings, I get it. And the only way really to get through it is to go through it.
It
And
is.
to feel it and release it.
And it's not getting stuck in the feelings of it.
Yes.
Because I know for me, when I had the miscarriage, it was like I felt this silent scream inside of me. And
Mhm.
I would literally just like open my mouth and
Yeah.
because if I put words to it, if I put sound to it, it would be like the Princess Bride when Wesley's in the dungeon and they throw him up to like suck all the life out of him. And like when I saw that movie, I'm like, I know what that sound feels like. Like I know that
Yeah.
that wasn't new to me.
Sure.
And in the movie, it's like, oh yeah, you can hear him, but I think it's not Fezzik, but the swordsman says something. That's the sound of grief, and he recognizes it because of the way his father died, right? Because he's
Mhm.
felt it, and
Yeah.
so when you've truly felt that grief, there is this element of, if I let go of this, it's going to control me. I won't
Mm.
have control over any of this. And
Mhm.
it almost feels like it's going to destroy you
Sure.
because it's so
Yeah.
powerful. So
It is.
it's really important to unpack it in
Yeah.
pieces that don't feel like they're going to destroy you in the process.
Yes. I'm so glad you named that. It's so, so important. And something I do as a therapist is I help make sure that we go at a pace where it doesn't become overwhelming, to help somebody really process without getting stuck in it, without becoming so flooded that it feels like they get stuck. It's too much or too overwhelming. It's so important to go at a pace that feels safe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because, I mean, it was very interesting when I had that 3-hour sob.
Mhm.
There was nothing scary about it.
Yeah.
There was
Wow.
nothing scary. It felt very safe. And it just was like this well being emptied. And
Yes.
that was so beautiful.
Yeah.
And, so completely different than, the silent scream that was going on after the miscarriage.
Mhm.
Because the other one had been silenced for a long time.
Yeah.
My perspective, what the difference
Mhm.
was.
Sure.
But the other one had been silenced for a long time. And so letting it out was almost joyous.
Yeah.
Even though there was all this sadness, there was joy, especially because I could not cry with asthma because it goes into your lungs. You can't breathe, right? What do you do when you cry?
Mm.
So then I would do is okay, I can't breathe. I prefer to breathe than to cry. And so you'd swallow the grief so you wouldn't let the grief out. And
Yeah.
so I could suddenly cry. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh, wow, this is amazing. And to just be able to let all that grief out was
Mhm.
so incredible.
Wow. And how amazing that you didn't have an asthma attack
I have not had
afterwards.
an asthma attack since.
That is just like case in point here,
Right?
how our body
Our
can.
lungs are connected to the grief and distress. That's
Yeah.
the emotion connected with the lungs. So anybody who's having difficulty breathing, if you have asthma, if you have, whatever's going on with the lungs, the key is to figure out what is that grief and to release
Mm.
it. It's so important because that's how our body talks to us. You were talking about our body remembers,
Mhm.
right? And so if you've got an ache or a pain that is regular or stress related, that's your body saying, hey, I'm here and I need some attention. It's
Yep.
not just give me a pill.
Yes.
No, go find out what is that body part telling you.
Yeah.
And whether you see a healer, whether you see a therapist, and I like to do both because I
Sure.
find, we're mind, body, soul, right?
Yeah,
So
100%.
not everybody understands the language of the body saying this hurts, this is what I need to do. So a healer can speak that language and say,
Yeah.
well, this is what this pain means. Okay,
Mhm.
fine, that's good. And you empty a bunch of stuff out, but then you can go to a therapist and say, okay, tell me what's going on in my brain that this is getting
Yeah.
stuck, and you can unstick it. And for me, using the two of them in conjunction with each other is super powerful.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. And I think I love how you talk about the mind, body, spirit. And I think therapy is a really important part of healing. And it's not the only part of healing. And so I love that you've utilized both in your life.
Yeah. I was very fortunate when I had depression in my early 30s, really bad. And I was very fortunate the therapist I found understood the healing aspect as well. And
Mhm.
I'd go to her and say, well, this word keeps coming up on the healing, so let's figure out why.
Uh-huh.
Because
Sure.
some people like, well, that's just nonsense, but
Yeah.
she was very open to it. And she really truly helped me get through the depression.
Wow.
And I've had a few other therapists, and
Mhm.
but I was very grateful for her because of her approach to things
Sure.
and the way she explained, things that were going on. And I didn't feel like a crazy person in her office. I
Good. That's sign of a
felt
good
like a
therapist.
crazy person. I felt like a crazy person in the world. I'm like, wait a minute,
Mm.
this isn't. But I went to her and she's like, no, you're not crazy. I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
thank you, thank you, thank you. Because sometimes our support group is the one telling us we're crazy.
Yeah.
And it's like having somebody else like, hey, wait, let's break this down.
Yeah. And
you know?
say what your reactions, how you're showing up in the world, it makes a lot of sense. Anybody that's gone through what you've gone through is going to show up in the world in the same way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Oh my gosh, time got away. So,
Fabulous.
all right, I want to give you a few minutes to plug yourself in. And if there's can you give us something to, like, what do we do in grief? I mean, we've talked a lot about stuff, but can you give us like a tip or something that
Yeah. To summarize, I'll say it's okay to have feelings. If you're noticing feelings, try to notice them without judging them or say, I should or shouldn't feel this way.
those shoulds.
Yeah.
Shoulds. We
Anytime I
shouldn't put
hear,
on ourselves.
yeah, anytime I hear should with a feeling, I'm like, let's look at that. So it can be helpful to approach your feelings with curiosity rather than judgment. And just remember, what we've talked about today, what Jeanette shared, that there can be that beauty through the grief.
It
So
doesn't
just
feel
remember
beautiful.
that.
It does not feel
I know.
beautiful at all.
And there's space when you get to that
And
point,
there's some peace in it.
there's that peace, and that peace is, I find, beautiful. My name's Mary Catherine O'Connor. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in California. I'm also a telehealth provider in Florida. If you are seeking mental health support, you can reach me at marycatherinelcsw.com, at gmail.com, and on Instagram, marycatherinelcsw. Thank you so much for having me today.
Oh, Mary, this was wonderful. You got something, Mark?
I was going to say before you disappeared that apparently we have a listener that is watching today, and they were saying that they were connecting to you, Jeanette, because they are coming to us from the Philippines. So it looks like they have joined us
Oh.
from YouTube, and it says it's love. SMHIA channel. So apparently they have connected with you and they've already connected on the network and they are from the Philippines. So you have a fan in the Philippines. So that's what I wanted to share with
Wow,
you,
very
that you just got
fantastic.
a listener and they are on there. You can see their face there on the picture, but we have somebody that is watching and was engaged in the conversation with you and everything that is
Were
coming to
they
us.
posting? Because I can't. We have to figure out why I can't read this. It's like 3-point font. So
Okay.
were there comments that we need to address?
They just were waving and letting you know that they had connected to you. So they said that they had connected to the host, which would be you and everything. And then they were letting you know that they were from the Philippines. So I kind of read what they had said and all
Oh,
along
that's very
those lines.
sweet. Thank you.
No, definitely. And I know we're going to end just really quickly, Mary, because y'all had alluded to it earlier, and we can go over just a minute or two. But everything, the other thing that I find funny sometimes is y'all were talking about relationships and that being a loss as well, because I have definitely heard people that have used that term of ghosting, which is basically what happens if you are just checking out of a relationship and all in that space. And that seems to be a loss that particularly folks that are a little bit younger than me talk about, and everything is how they are ghosting their relationships.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And ghosting can be painful because there's not that space to really process the loss and it's unclear. It's not saying, hey, I don't want to see you anymore. It's, I'm just not hearing from you, which raises a lot of questions and confusion and an inherent lack of closure.
Yep.
So
No
try
doubt
not to
about
ghost y'all.
it.
Well, I think too, it's a chicken way out. I mean, sometimes things fade away. Okay, fine. But I think also it's a way of not addressing what your issue is. It's like, now if it's somebody you saw in a chat site and you're chatting and they say something, it may not be worth, you
Mhm.
know, but if it's a longtime friend and they've sent or done something to offend you, instead of just saying, "Oh, well, ew, I don't want you." So many times things get misunderstood.
Yeah.
And instead of doing that, saying, "Hey, you really hurt my feelings when such and such. And, I appreciate your friendship. I care about you a lot and I don't want this to stop." So, I have a dear friend who we off, we would do that all the time and it was really wonderful. And half the time, most of the time, what we thought the other person said wasn't exactly what was said at all, and or what was meant. And I think, when we're stressed, we say things. If you're going through that trauma, if you're experiencing that anxiety, the kindest words don't always come out when
Yeah.
we're anxious. And it's not that you're trying to be mean, it's that honestly, the person going through that grief, the person going through that trauma, that anxiety, is probably being more mean to themselves than they are to anybody else. And it sometimes comes out with other people, and you know did you mean to say that? Is that really what your intention was? And it's sometimes hard to say, hey, you hurt my feelings,
Hmm.
and if the relationship's worth it to you. But I think too, there is this, swipe right idea, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, I'll just get somebody else who won't treat me badly. And a sense that friendships are more replaceable than
Yeah. And it's
more.
sad because some of the most profound and healing friendships can come from having these tough conversations. By
Absolutely.
saying this, hey, this hurt.
Right.
I don't like this. And it gives the other person a chance to say, hey, I'm sorry.
Right.
And that's an experience not everyone gets to have, is receiving an apology, receiving a acknowledgement, and I'm going to do things differently. And so when you ghost, you're almost cheating yourself out of the opportunity to have a true healing reparative experience too.
And that affects how you deal with the next relationship too. It's not just maybe, you know, I don't know, maybe what they've said is something that you can't forgive. But it's doesn't mean that it's going to make you stronger for the next relationship too.
Hmm.
But ironically, and I know we're wrapping up, but sometimes I think people ghost because they don't know how to deal with those unexpected losses that y'all have been talking about on this show.
No,
Because I do know that some people have ghosted friends and folks because they were very sick. They might have been terminal, or there might have been other problems going on, and they didn't know how to handle
right?
that and
They
all
didn't
along
know
the
how to deal with the grief. They didn't
yeah.
know how to deal with the grief for themselves, and they couldn't deal with the grief. I mean, I've dealt with grief since I was born practically. But so for me, it's like, yeah, okay, we got this covered. But you still have to go through it. That doesn't make it easier. It's just,
Absolutely.
okay, I know this path I got to go on. But for people who have never had gone through that grief, it's scary. As
Yeah.
they say, when somebody dies, everybody's there at the funeral, but when do you really need somebody is 3 weeks later.
Yeah.
Nobody's
That's
there. They've returned to their lives.
right.
They don't know how to help you. They've all said, "Oh, I'll be there for you if you need anything," but they don't know what that means for that person. And
Exactly.
so, if you're sitting like me on the couch, afraid to pick up the phone and say, "I have an emergency," that's not an emergency, you know,
Hmm.
it's somebody may have come over, but I couldn't handle her. No, I'm busy today, you
Yeah.
know? And so the help, we don't check on people. Hey, and it's not, hey, how are you doing? I mean, that's nice, but just like, hey, I'm coming over. What are you doing on Thursday? Let's go out.
Yeah.
I'm coming over. Let's have dinner. You know, it's it's not waiting for them to ask because the person grieving doesn't know how to ask. Not always.
Yeah.
It's hey, I'm here. You know, I had I saw there was somebody, I don't forget if it's on ad for this or if it was somebody I know that went through it, but um there was a death and they were sent groceries like 2 weeks later. Because everybody's bringing you food at the beginning, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's more
Yeah.
food than you know what to do with.
Sure.
But 2 weeks later, especially if it's a spouse, partner, cooking for one, maybe you weren't the cooker in the family.
Hmm.
What do I do?
Yeah.
You know?
Sorry about that, but I had to actually get something at my door, the cultural center. But yeah, that's what I was saying is that, yeah, I know sometimes people are not able to deal with it because somebody may have a health issue. Because I know that people have ghosted because the person might have been either terminal or they might have been just very sick and they don't know how to deal with it or even know how to deal with what you were talking about earlier, like the move if they're moving away
Mhm.
and everything. So sometimes people will ghost because it is their way, and some people would say it's a coward way, but it's their way of coping with the loss that they're about to face and everything in that space.
Yeah.
All right. So,
Well,
do you have any good news for us? Do you want to give us a happy tip? How do we get happy?
great. Ask yourself 2 questions.
Yes.
How am I feeling?
Yes.
And what do I need?
Oh, that second one's a tough one, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Try practicing that and listening to the first answer that comes up. You'll be surprised how much healing can happen when you ask yourself, what do I need? And then take the
Pretty
steps
good.
to meet it.
And I'm going to make a little switch to that because energetically, the word need is all about lack.
Mhm.
And we don't want to use need because that keeps us in that state, as
Thank
does the
you.
word want. So instead of need, we use the word require. And instead of
Ah,
want, we use the word desire. Think about
ooh,
it.
I
What
love
do
that.
I want versus what do I desire?
And what do I require?
And what do I require?
Ooh,
So
okay.
need still
Use that.
keeps you in that lack, but what do I require? I require someone to come sit on the couch with me.
Mm-hmm.
That comes from a much more, can you feel the power there?
I can. I love it. I'm going to adapt that.
Right? And then what do I desire? What do I want? Well, what do I want? What I want's never going to happen. I can't have it. I, you know, I want, I want whatever I desire.
Mm.
I'm
Doesn't
liking
that
this
feel
idea,
good?
Jeanette, and everything. So I'm thinking that I because actually that was actually a jazz singer that came by because they had a concert here yesterday and she was coming to pick up her music and everything. So I need music, but I require nature. So I'm liking
Ah,
your attitude and everything. And that would be my answer is I need music and I require nature. And I don't know what Mary's is, but something like that could be the answer instead of the wants and the wants and the other ways that we do this on a regular basis.
Absolutely.
awesome.
And it's so much part of our vernacular too. This lack is rooted in our words. But if we can change our words to come from place of power, magical things get to happen.
So magical.
Speaking of magical things, I know that we've got two other shows and everything. One of the shows is a show that deals with this topic, and I hope that you ladies will catch it. That I know Stephanie Hockenhall and her son do on a regular basis. Matter of fact, they do it every Sunday at 6 o'clock called Where is the Love? And it actually deals with what they consider, and I kind of agree with them, the epidemic of bullying, because they talk about that and talk about that every Sunday at 6 o'clock and have guests coming in as well. And then, of course, we've got the Thursday show that features one of your two friends, Jeanette, and everything, because that is the show that is called Empowering You. That is part of what Barbara and Shani Smith do. So Shani Smith, of course, is the founder of that lovely thing that you love to promote as well. So I'll let you give the plug before I play the closeout and everything in that space.
So we've been talking today a lot about a lot about mind, body, and spirit. But one of the things you got to do to keep your health going is fill it with good stuff. And with that, we use Can Do Spice.
You know how people love to enjoy food and don't understand how to flavor their food or how to replicate a meal? They're interested in supplements, but don't know where to begin? Well, what I do is I take the guesswork out of enjoying flavor and wellness with my flavorful spice blends so that they can create delicious meals with healing benefits. Can Do Spice was created to help cooks at any level enjoy healing through food. Every spice blend was designed to give added health benefits of natural herbs. Every blend is complete. There's no need to add any additional spice for a delicious meal. Saving you time and money while adding supplements to your meals can be both tasty and fun. My earliest memories in the kitchen began with my father, Kenny Can Do Bond, so it was fitting that I would name this line after him. I have always looked to natural remedies to supplement the body, and I found myself hiding herbs and minerals in foods for my family. That's when it hit me. Everyone needs Can Do Spice. Everyone should be having this. It's an exclusive brand for cooks at any level who want to create flavorful dishes with healing benefits that can satisfy the body and soul. Add a little spice to your life. Give Can Do Spice a try.